In this video, you'll learn how to take your gauge swatch. A gauge swatch is important because it tells you how many stitches and how many rows you're going to get over a certain measured area. And that's going to correspond to how whatever you're making fits. Typically, I don't do a gauge swatch if I'm not actually fitting the garment to my body. So like a scarf, a washcloth, even an afghan, I really wouldn't do gauge swatches for those. But if you're going to wear the garment, you want to make sure that you do a gauge swatch so that it fits properly. Your pattern will tell you what kind of gauge you want to get. And if you're using a British pattern, it's going to call gauge tension. So you'll see tension instead of gauge. All right, I have my woven rain hat pattern that was in the fall issue of Interweave Knits. And I chose this one because sometimes your patterns will give you multiple gauges for different types of stitches within the garment. So for example, this one, we have our gauge done over a herringbone pattern and then also over a seed stitch. So I'm going to zoom in so hopefully you can see it. Alright, so here's gauge right down here at the bottom. And for this gauge, it says 26 stitches and 28 rows equals 4 inches in woven herringbone pattern. And 20 stitches and 32 rows equals 4 inches in seed stitch. So whatever pattern you're using, it's going to tell you the gauge. So you're not actually going by this pattern, you're going by the pattern that you are about to knit. Alright, so let's go ahead and figure out how to do gauge. I have just knit a swatch here, just in stockinette stitch to use as an example. Typically when you do gauge, you are going to end up washing and blocking your swatch just like you would with your regular garment. So this one I've gone ahead and washed and blocked it. And I'm going to zoom in so you can see these stitches a little more clearly. The things that you'll need when taking gauge is your swatch, obviously, and then also a tape measure. And I like to use marking pins. It just helps to identify where the stitches are for counting. Typically when I do my gauge swatch, I knit it a little bit bigger than 4 inches so that I can actually measure evenly across those 4 inches without having to worry about these curled edges, especially in stockinette stitch. Alright, so what I have done, or what I'm going to do, is take my measuring tape, and if you see each of these little V's, that's a stitch. So I'm going to start at the end of one of those V's, right there, and I'm going to place my pin. Okay, then I'm going to go over to 4 inches, just very close to this edge, and I'm going to place my other pin. Oops. And you want to make sure that you're placing it across the same row that you started. So there it is. Okay, so now I have my 2 pins for my stitches, so I'm going to go ahead, oops, you can't see near one, and just count across. Remember, each of the V's is a stitch, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. So my gauge for this is 18 stitches over 4 inches. To get my per inch number, I would just divide 18 by 4. Now that was my stitch gauge. To get my row gauge, I'm going to measure vertically. Okay, so again, we're going to start at the bottom of one of those V's, just right there. And then we're going to go and place the next one 4 inches up. Okay, now what I'm going to do is just count up this row to see how many rows I have. Let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27, and then this last one, 28. So I have 28 rows and 18 stitches equals 4 inches. Again, to get the per inch row number, you're just going to divide 28 by 4. Alright, so that's how you take your gauge swatch. Let's say though that the gauge that I needed to get for this was 20 stitches and I only got 18. The way to counteract that is to go back and do another gauge swatch with different needles. So if your gauge swatch, if you're getting too many stitches, then you want to try going up a needle size or two. Too many stitches, go up a needle size or two. If you're getting too few stitches, you want to go down a needle size or two. Okay, again, down a needle size or two if you're getting too few stitches. If you keep doing your gauge swatch and you're just not getting gauge over, you've done two needle sizes up, I don't know if I would suggest going any further than 2 needle sizes because your stitches might end up being either way too loose or way too tight, but it's up to your personal preference. You know, I guess with knitting there's really no right or wrong as long as you're happy with the fabric. But do remember that in order to get a garment to fit your body properly, you do need to get gauge for the pattern. And gauge is important to get even up to 1/8 of a stitch, because if you multiply that out over the length of a garment, or the width of a garment, then it's going to end up not fitting properly. It'll be a little bit too big or too small depending on what your gauge is. Also, if you can get one of the two numbers, so you can get your row gauge but not your stitch gauge, it's more important to get your stitch gauge. If you can get your stitch gauge, you're good, because usually in patterns they're going to have you knit or work in the pattern over a certain measurement, not over a certain number of rows. So if you can get one of the two numbers, make sure that you're getting the stitch gauge. That's the important one.